Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. This week, we're going to talk about Ruins, Part 3, the X-Files Extended Universe book. Picking up where we left off from last week, we're going to explore the illegal antiquities trade and the concept of huecheros. We are also going to talk about the concepts of provenance, provenience, and context as it relates to archaeology and art history, and how that is erased by illegal antiquities trade, including the purchase of these items by European and U.S. museums. So first up, as we established in the previous episode on Ruins, illegal antiquities trades, or looting, in Mesoamerica dates back almost to the Spanish colonization of the area. And originally, a lot of these Mayan sites were spared from looting because it's not known that they're there. They're kind of hidden in the jungle. But by the 20th century, archaeologists were elbows deep in the dirt, working in that region and looking for these gorgeous cities, especially those in southern Mexico and Central America. And they kept on doing that until about the 1970s to 80s, and then there was some civil strife in the area, so the scientists had to leave the sites because they weren't safe to work at. But while they had been there and uncovering these sites and documenting these artifacts and everything, they had hired a lot of people who worked with them to help them find the sites, to help them cut through the growth of the jungle to get to the sites, to help them navigate in general, and to help them translate or interpret in the area. So these workers are a lot like the workers we see in the book Ruins. Fernando Victorio Aguilar is a person who is a worker there with the archaeologists, who they hired to take them out into the jungle to help them safely get to where they're going, navigate to where they're going, and also help do some of the manual labor in some cases, like Fernando Victorio Aguilar's hired hand Pepe. A lot of archaeological work requires you to know what you're looking for and to recognize artifacts and ecofacts when you see them that are relevant to what you're looking for. If you're not an archaeologist, you might see a big old pile of rocks and shells and stuff and think, oh, this is just a weird deposit of this, or that's just garbage, who cares about that? But those are possibly shell middens, and that's essentially people's trash from way back when, and archaeologists are very interested in that. Those are the materials that people used, that people, even if they didn't use them, they considered them before they discarded them. And it can tell you a lot about how the people lived back then. But also, a lot of archaeology is manual labor. And for those parts of it, like screening dirt, you don't really need a degree for it. You just need to know when to stop and go, hey, this might be something of interest. So hauling the dirt out of the areas you're excavating and then screening it. So you're holding like a big old box. So it's a frame, right? And then in the middle of it, you have a piece of screen. And it's just helping you sift through all of the dirt. whatever soil type that may be, to get to the artifacts. So the dirt should mostly fall through, and then you can look at what's left over and see if it's an artifact or just a big clod of dirt, and so on. And those are the type of things that people sometimes hire workers for in the archaeological field. And you see kind of a mention of this as well in the movie For the Mummy, which is also about looting in and of itself, but told more from a looter's perspective, really. I guess ultimately The Mummy, just like Ruins, is told from a couple of different perspectives. We get to see Benny's side of it, and also Rick's side of it, and the scholarly side of it with Evie, and more straight up looting on the part of Jonathan, Evie's brother, and also the perspective of the bodyguards or the protectors of the city of Amanoptera, the Magi. So you get several different perspectives in both The Mummy and in Ruins. So I suppose they also have that in common, as well as involving some types of hidden cities and or pyramidal structures, although this Mayan one is a step pyramid, and it is not a geometric pyramid, which is a geometrical solid that has that square base and then equilateral triangular sides. So those are the Egyptian pyramids, or the type that we think of anyway. The Egyptians also had step pyramids at certain points, as did many other places around the world. And they often ended up being in that geometrical solid pyramid shape or in the step pyramid shape, because that's the most structurally stable shape for projects that have large amounts of masonry or stone. It's pretty much convergent cultural evolution. And keep in mind, though, that not all ruins that are found are pyramids. There are lots of very valuable structures, including and especially places where people kept track of their lives around them. Archaeologists don't just care about how people who are rich lived. They don't just want to know about the folks who may be buried in these great pyramids and in these enormous wealthy tombs. They also want to know what the common people did, where they lived, how they lived, what they ate. And they use a lot of different tools to tell them that, including things like radiocarbon dating, also using other forms of isotope analysis. Certain kinds are used for different things, like telling what someone ate or the areas that they lived in based on the isotopes in the different water tables around them. You can tell a lot about how people lived and their diets, etc. through isotope analysis, and some of my friends from grad school study that. You can also do other things, like dendrochronology, finding trees in the area that you can date and counting the rings. You find other things in context, in the same layers that you're excavating as everything else. You look at the changes in the soil to tell that. And to do so, often they'll use something called a Munsell book. And it tells you about the color and the composition of the soil. So is it like a loam, like a rich soil that's really good for growing certain types of things? And is it, very dark brown in color? Or is it a yellow clay or a red clay? Or does it have a bunch of silt in it? Is it some type of combination? And it has these plotted out on a page. I want you to think like hair color swatches when you go to the salon sometimes, and you can put your hair underneath it next to it and see what color it might be, like what it would kind of contrast as versus what you already have right now. And it works kind of like that. It has like paint chips is essentially what it looks like, or like the little things you get at Lowe's, the paint swatches, and they have these little holes underneath them. and that allows you to hold that over top of the soil and characterize it that way. And that makes sure that even if you are somewhat colorblind or your vision is a little bit different from someone else's, if you put it underneath that piece of paper, then you should still be able to replicate that because you're matching it as close as you can get it to the color that's actually there, to your reference color, rather than just saying, oh, this was kind of orange yellow, but maybe you see more red than someone else does. So it's a pretty cool way to standardize it, but you do need to make sure that if you're looking at it wet, that you're always looking at it wet, or dry, always looking at it dry. And the same thing for a lot of ground surveys that you're doing, like resistivity surveys, where you're sending electrical currents through the ground at every however many feet that you decide. It just makes a grid at those regular intervals. And then as the electrical current goes through the soil, it measures the electrical resistance. And that's going to vary based on how wet the ground is versus dry. It's going to also be affected by the presence of archaeological features. And once you have one of those plotted out, then you can kind of look at it either in programs like Excel, where you can conditionally format the values, or in other programs, and see if it can be interpreted as being mostly groundwater, or if it's dry out and everything, if it can be interpreted as being a possible archaeological site. That way you're not just digging blind test pits everywhere you go. Nowadays, there are a lot more of these geophysical properties that we can check out electronically. We're able to take out all kinds of survey methods and tools, from GPS locators or ground penetrating radar, sending radio waves into the ground and then measuring their reflected signals. That's a hyper simplification of it, but you get the general gist. We have some pretty awesome tools nowadays that help us to find these things, but you also still can't beat having the cultural component of boots on the ground, of having people who are locals telling you about the history of the areas that they grew up in, and the stories that their families have passed down for years. And I like that Ruins also shows an appreciation of that. You can tell that the author put a lot of work into how this might actually be performed. I'm still not entirely sure if in 1996 it was just all what seemed to be grad students from the first couple of chapters out here leading this entire expedition for what would be an amazing archaeological find. But I digress. Beyond that, I haven't had any problems with it so far, and they seem to have a really great grasp on that. Everything from the types of pyramids and other structures that are present, down to the antiquities trade and the folks who are involved in these archaeological expeditions. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how these folks who are native to the area and who have worked with archaeologists in the past become experts in their own right in locating these ancient tombs. Stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were reintroducing the concept of looting in Mesoamerica and talking about the different types of pyramids and how workers often do accompany archaeologists on these expeditions as a valuable source of not only excess labor, but also expertise in finding these places through passing the information down culturally. Now that we've covered the background of the concept, we're also going to talk about where in the 70s and 80s, civil strife ejected the scientists from the archaeological sites and just left the workers behind, the people who were already native to the area and who are often paid as day laborers. These folks are effectively, once the scientists leave, the experts in the area, the only experts in the area. They were already experts in the area before, but now the only experts in the area in locating these ancient tombs. They've had a lot of the archaeological training, and they know from experiential learning, what would be a valuable artifact versus what is perhaps just something random or wouldn't necessarily be valuable. Although, keep in mind, being valuable archaeologically is not necessarily the same thing as being valuable in just a general financial sense, but particularly in the antiquities trade, and vice versa. But for a lot of these workers, when the archaeologists left, this was the trade that they had learned, how to go out there and help excavate. But now they didn't have the external funding for doing it. So a lot of folks went out and used the skills that they had learned to raid some of these sites for things they can sell on the black market. It's also likely that folks from surrounding areas who were perhaps not as concerned with the civil strife as they were with money also raided these sites. And one of the ways that folks would often raid these sites would be to dig little tunnels into the sides of the hills that used to be pyramids. And when they create these tunnels by digging into the sides of them or dislodging stones and stuff from the side, then it leaves that trench area open, and beforehand, everything inside of the pyramids would have been preserved by the fact that there's not water in there. But once the trench is opened, then the rain can get in through those tunnels and it can destroy the entire structure. It can erode a bunch of things away and just damage other things that might otherwise have been preserved had they been kept dry. So some rich person somewhere may have a really beautiful jade carving or something in their private collection, but the entire archaeological structure that it came from and many other things that may still be inside there are destroyed in the process. Additionally, once you pull these pieces out of their archaeological context, you can't ever put them back. It's the same rule with things at a crime scene. So if you were watching a lot of procedural dramas or you were big into CSI in the 90s and 2000s, then, you're not supposed to move any evidence at the crime scene. You document all of it. Then you go ahead and collect it once you have pictures and documentation of everything in situ. And you know how far apart everything was, etc. You have it measured, you have it documented. Because how close something is to something else can be really important. How close is the handgun to the body that is on the ground? That could help you figure out whether this was an accidental death, or it can help you figure out if it was a homicide or a suicide. That context matters. It also matters if the person is laying on the ground and they have a knife in their back. That's not really a common way that people commit suicide, so that can give you some more context clues. Very similarly, in archaeology, that context matters. Where was that figurine in the ruins? That could help tell you if that area was perhaps of ritual significance, Or maybe it was a nursery. Maybe that was a child's toy. Or maybe it's a very valuable artifact and it was used in trade and exchange. But you can't really tell any of that if you remove it from the context. If you remove the gun from the crime scene and you can't tell somebody where exactly you found it, you don't have that documentation of any type, then it's not really important anymore. Rather, we know that it could be important, and it likely was important, but we're not able to tell you any more information about the area other than this was recovered here. Was it even involved? We don't know. We have extra steps to take now to try to figure some of that stuff out. And it works that way with archaeology. So even if archaeologists recover some of these artifacts that have been looted in the illegal antiquities trade, then you're not able to put them back. Once they're moved, you cannot put them back. So you're not able to reconstruct how this is. And that's the concept of context, as well as provenance and provenience in archaeology. Now those words sound very similar to each other, but they have two separate meanings. So in archaeology, as well as art history, provenance means the detailed history of where that artifact has been since its creation. So think about it as being like the chain of custody or an heirloom that's been passed down through generations, like the things people take on Antiques Roadshow. That's particularly important for art historians because they can tell more about it if they know who owned it. That helps them establish the object's authenticity. If they have a clear record of who owned what at what times, then that can tell them, hey, this is authentic. But if there's a gap in that chain of custody or chain of history, then the object might actually be a forgery. We do have an artist in this group in Ruins, the initial archaeology group, so I wanted to include that one too. But provenience is the one primarily used in archaeology. And that is that precise location where that artifact or that archaeological sample was recovered in the archaeological context. And that would help you retrace your steps and see where it is. And you take 3D measurements of these things as well. There's a lot of work that goes into it, and you will use the Pythagorean theorem to help establish this and figure it out so that it can be replicated later. But overall, the point is that it is drawn in a certain way. And in 3D space, you have X, Y, and Z coordinates and several different types of maps, including some just in the X and Y planes, to help you reconstruct where this is and to put it back together over the years. So think about it as being like inverse architecture. So architecture, you build those blueprints and you can put them on top of each other and really see how the buildings are going to be built. And archaeology is starting with the structure and no blueprints and kind of going, okay, where are these things in space? Where are these objects in space? And how is the context in which they are located from each other? How does that inform us about what happened? What these things were used for and why and how often and how prevalent is this? There's all kinds of information you can get from it. You can tell more about specialization of trade or the types of skill sets that were heavily utilized by different groups, whether that be age groups or sex or gender groups at that time. It may not seem like much, but there's a ton of information that you can get from provenience in archaeology and also from provenance if you care about where an artifact has been since it's been created. The easiest way to remember the difference between these is that provenience is where an artifact was born and provenance is its resume, where it's been, what it's done. And birthplace can be meant as where it was created and or where it was recovered from. So without all that information, it might not seem as big of a deal for folks to go through and loot these artifacts. Because, after all, it's just a bunch of old stuff, right? Well, yes, to some people, but to a lot of other people, no. We see in the book that Señor Salida is collecting these items because he just likes the art style. And Fernando is also of the belief that he just also does it so he can look really rich and look really cultured. And he is really rich. He's a drug lord. So it's the black market fueling itself in a way. So we have black market antiquities, we also have drugs, and we have firearms being dealt in here, all essentially through the same group of people. Whether they be people involved with the liberation movement, or the drug runners, or the actual government. We have all of these people trading in these different black market antiquities. And so even if you don't care about where these antiques came from, where these ancient pieces of culture that folks live their lives around and that can tell us about the past, even if you don't care anything about those, by people going and raiding them and creating this black market structure for them, it not only removes information about the past, but it also is deeply entwined in funding a lot of more nefarious black market things, like the illegal drug trade and the sex trafficking trades, and also drug cartels. After all, one person's trash is another person's treasure, and that is especially true in archaeology. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to pick up with Maya looting in the context of Guatemala's civil war. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about looting of Mayan sites and how these black market trades fuel each other while also erasing cultural context and history. Now we're going to talk about where the Guatemalan Civil War landed our looters of Mayan artifacts. So as we discussed in our last episode, we're talking about the area of Quintana Roo in the book Ruins. So this is on the Yucatan Peninsula, and it is near Cancun. So Cancun is like the largest city in Quintana Roo, and that is part of Mexico. It's a Mexican state. So right below it is Guatemala and Belize, El Salvador, and Honduras. These areas are all very close to each other, and so even though the Civil War was in Guatemala, right across the border is Guatemala, and so chaos and warfare really know no bounds. Rather, they at least don't respect them. So during their Civil War period, back then, a pot that was made in the area might get someone who's looting about $20 US or 100 if it was really nice. But that's all the person who's looting or digging, doing that day labor type work, would get. The final buyer, though, would pay somewhere between $10,000 to $20,000. That's a lot of money. And like many things, the finder's fee is not very much, and the price gets jacked up so that the buyer is paying a crazy amount of money, whereas the folks who are finding them aren't getting squat. So there have been anthropologists who lived among people who were looters. So not just archaeologists go and study this, sometimes cultural anthropologists do as well. And cultural anthropologists will study all kinds of aspects of human culture and human behavior. So it's not uncommon for them to check out things that are considered to be more taboo, particularly as studied by sociologists. Cultural anthropologists want to get in there and understand things firsthand. A lot like how journalists will go and be on the ground in the actual area where breaking events are occurring. They pretty much just write the information down for different target audiences and by using different perspectives. So some archaeologists and other types of anthropologists who have studied the area around the Northern Triangle have estimated that there are several million people who are what they call subsistence diggers. And subsistence diggers are folks who go out to loot or dig to make these $20 to $100 at a time of these findings. Keep in mind, you're going to get more money if these things are intact and they look really nice. And a lot of times, it's been decades to centuries to millennia of when these objects last saw the light of day or oxygen or any components of the world around it outside of the enclosure of the ruins they were in or the soil that they were in. A lot of these things get broken over the years, and so they might not be getting that much money from it. Although there are reportedly several million subsistence diggers in the area, only a fraction of them do it full-time. Very few of them do this full-time, because you're not going to be able to make that much money doing it full-time if a lot of it is broken. Archaeologists are jazzed about pottery shards, but collectors, perhaps not so much. Now, the Guatemalan Civil War is relevant not just to our general discussion of antiquities trades in Mesoamerica, but also specifically to the book. So remember, we said that around the 70s, it just became way too unsafe for these anthropologists to be down there, and so they had to leave the area, and part of that was due to the Guatemalan Civil War. And our book picks up in 1996. Well, the Guatemalan Civil War was fought from 1960 to 1996, and it was fought between the government of Guatemala and a bunch of different leftist rebel groups. And they say that these were supported initially by the ethnic Maya indigenous people and some Ladino peasants. And together, they made up the rural poor of the area. And we see this reflected in the book as well. So in Ruins, Pepe Candelaria is one of the hired hands of Fernando Aguilar. So Fernando is the middleman who is selling these artifacts to the really rich guys who are paying $10,000, $20,000 for these pots. Whereas he's only paying Pepe, Fernando that is only paying Pepe like a sack of pesos is what it says. They didn't specifically say how many in the book, I don't believe. But we know that Carlos Borreo, the police chief, and Fernando got a bunch of money and decided they were going to drive up to Cancun and spend it. Whereas they just dropped Pepe off at the end of the road and were like, hey, here's a sack of pesos. Go ahead and slash your way through the jungle with nothing but your machete right now. Didn't even give him a bottle of water or anything. Just told him to go for it. And he's like, that, right, like from here, that will take me days. And they're like, it'll only take you a day, too, if you're slow. And just force this man to go off into the woods. And they do say that he is an indigenous person in the area too. So he would be one of the diggers who is going out there, digging up these artifacts, and then giving it to that middleman who is going, oh, hey, here's $20. Here's a sack of pesos for your find and all of your hard, backbreaking work digging up these artifacts and screening them and everything. Now I'm going to go and sell it to some rich guy for a crazy amount more, exponentially, orders of magnitude more than what they're paying the people who are finding them. And in that way, the antiquities trade keeps poor people poor and also fuels violence that disproportionately impacts them in the area they live in. Guatemala's civil war is specifically relevant to this story because they talk about the involvement of federal agents from the United States, by the way, the United States is federal agents, in Latin American politics. They talk a little bit about the DEA, but we're going to talk about the CIA. So in that 36-year conflict from 1960 to 1996, the Guatemalans experienced one of the most brutal conflicts in Latin American history. More than 200,000 people were killed, and most of them were indigenous. On top of that, more than 500,000, 500,000, were driven from their homes, and many of them were raped and tortured. I think that we don't talk about this in the U.S. very often, but that we should, because the U.S. was largely responsible for it. In 1954, the CIA helped overthrow Guatemala's democratically elected president. And that president was supporting land reform that was going to benefit the largely indigenous peasantry in the area. We talked about how the people in the area were the united poor in the rural areas. But this was happening at the expense of the US-based United Fruit Company and a bunch of other private interests that were capitalistic in nature. So we helped to overthrow a democratically elected president from another country who was going to help support the indigenous people in the area because it was not going to benefit this fruit company that had land there from the U.S. And 6 years after that, in 1960, there was a rebellion to overthrow that military regime, and that is what started the war. So the rebellion in the area didn't actively kick off until 1960, but it was that action of the CIA helping to overthrow a democratically elected president that really spurred on this civil unrest. So over the years, the military and guerrillas in the area fought with each other, but increasingly, if you were seen as being even sympathetic to the rebels, then the military would target them, much like they did for folks who were accused of being Jewish sympathizers in Nazi Germany. And that even included Catholic priests, nuns, or entire indigenous villages. A lot of people were disappeared, and they do call them the disappeared. There were a lot of human rights abuses by the government against their own people, and the United States tended to support that. And in the late 70s, it was getting very bad, and it was already bad the entire time, but it was becoming more prevalent in the public eye. People in the United States were becoming more aware of it, to the point that they're like, hey, this is a problem. And Jimmy Carter tried to pressure Guatemala to stop those human rights abuses, but that failed. So a year later, in 1978, he barred the Defense Department from selling military equipment to Guatemala. And 2 years later, in 1980, he made that ban extend to being all commercial sales. But pre-approved shipments from before continued to go down there, so it was just no new shipments. Kind of like how in San Antonio a year or two ago, they decided that the cameras on traffic lights were not really effective. They weren't very efficacious, and they also were a violation of people's rights. So they decided no more of these are going to go up, but they're not going to take down any of them until 2030 because they have contracts with these companies. The cities have these contracts. The states have these contracts. So even though they've decided that as of this past year, these are not okay to have and use, because there is a capitalistic contract, they are not going to remove something they feel is unlawful. They're going to keep using them for another 9 years. So similarly, even though Jimmy Carter was like, hey, you guys aren't getting any more military equipment, no new deals, they still were sending out the shipments that had been previously approved. And there were a lot of them. In 81, Ronald Reagan became president, and he pretty much undid everything that Carter had done. So he had this stance about the Cold War in El Salvador and Nicaragua, and Reagan was really tough on the leftists of Guatemala. He was tough on the liberation groups, the rebels, not on the government who was committing human rights abuses against their own people. So he met with this evangelical pastor who was also the president of Guatemala at the time, and who had taken control of the country in a coup. And he was also a general, by the way, and he was the former Army Chief of Staff, and they decided that he was very committed to reforms and democracy, and so they spread that propaganda. And even though there was an embargo, financial support and military advising to the area continued, while U.S. allies like Israel continued to provide military equipment. And then in 1983, Reagan lifted that U.S. embargo, and within weeks of that, CIA cables in the area were reporting increased military abuses, increased human rights abuses conducted by the military of Guatemala on orders of this evangelical pastor general president. And they would continue for another 13 years. We're only at 1983 right now. This goes till 1996. And this is just Guatemala, by the way. The information about these increased military abuses were available to anyone who was associated with the CIA, so the people who oversaw them and had other people report to them, like Reagan, but they were classified for the longest time. They've since been declassified, and you can check them out online if you would like. In this way, the United States and their allies were largely responsible with funding and supplying arms for human rights abuses. And in the early 80s, right after Reagan lifted that U.S. embargo in 1983, those increases in military abuses documented some of the most horrific actions in the war. Those CIA cables reported some of the most horrific acts of the war occurring around that time. They were getting a renewed source of income and of arms. And it was not until 2013, another 17 years after the war ended, that a Guatemalan court found that general, who was also an evangelical pastor and a president, General Rios Montt, to be guilty of crimes against humanity and genocide against the Mayan people. You can also check out back issues of copies of the New York Times on their website. So you can go back and see articles from 1982, and they've digitized them for you. So you can look at them in the archives, and you can also look at them as though they were typed up yesterday. So there's two different ways. And there are tons of historical websites on this too, if you would like to do the research yourself. But this is also a lot of what led to the chaos that we're seeing today with refugees coming from Mesoamerica. They are very much refugees, and many of my friends have studied in this area over the years. I won't detail the human rights abuses for you on the podcast, but I would encourage you to check it out if that is something you are able to handle. I do think personally that it's important that we look at those things, the atrocities that have been in history, so that we learn from them. And at the very least, like archaeological context, knowing the history of the U.S. involvement in Guatemala can also give us some cultural context for changes that are happening in America today. Ruins does a good job in referencing all of these comorbid issues that were happening back then in order to build a picture of what's happening today. And although the book didn't really mean to do that, I mean, how could it know what was going to happen 14 years from then in the future? And by the book, of course, I mean the author, Kevin J. Anderson. There's no way he could have known, but by documenting what was happening back then, the book is still startlingly relevant today. There's also a component in some of the stories that I've read about the survivors of these attacks, of these atrocities. In a lot of areas, there were Mayan indigenous villages, and a lot of them were subject to military raids. And if you were a child, sometimes they would go ahead and not kill you, but they would show you the corpses of massacre victims as a warning to you, and then burn all of your homes down. So you had nowhere to go, and then you also didn't have parents anymore. They were showing you the corpses of the people in your community who helped raise you. Then they would relocate you to an isolated area, and you would perhaps starve, and maybe later on they might let you go, but they would only allow you to leave and to stay free on the condition that you serve in the military and participate in committing the same atrocities you had experienced against other people. And people they've interviewed who had been subjected to this absolutely break my heart, because they often say that they had no choice, but they still seek God's forgiveness for it. And it also reminds me of Teal'c in Stargate. We have several episodes of Stargate where Teal'c is reckoning with the terrible things he has done in the name of the Goa'uld, when he did believe in them. And even afterwards, when he was kind of trying to work with Braytak to help set everyone free, to help fight the Goa'uld from the inside. But he still had to do these terrible things the rest of the time. And Jack feels similarly with his time in Black Ops. But even when a group of people decide to try Teal'c for the crimes he committed as the first prime of Apophis, being in the military service of the oppressors and doing a large component of the oppressing, he went ahead and just said, yeah, I did those things and it haunts me every day and you should prosecute me for this. And he doesn't have any other recourse as far as he sees it. He's like, hey, my God doesn't exist anymore. There is no God for Teal'c to ask for forgiveness the way that some of the folks who in real life ended up having to serve their government and their military and commit these atrocities are seeking their God's forgiveness. I think that both Stargate and Ruins do a good job in trying to work through this. There's also another book that's not sci-fi related, but is relevant to this that I think that some of you guys might be really interested in. And it's a story about refugees and asylum seekers in the war in Sudan. So it's called They Poured Fire on Us from the Sky, the true story of 3 lost boys from Sudan. And it's by Benson Deng, Alphonsian Deng, Benjamin Ajak, and Judy Bernstein. So these are brothers and cousins who were considered lost boys from Sudan, so in the Sudanese wars. And how, as children, they very similarly were running and starving, but also being bombed and were subject to mass atrocities And also they tried to force them to do work for them by either joining the military or by building things for them, even though they were small children at the time. Small children can't fight back, and you can also more easily mold them into being what you want them to be, including killers for the state. We see that storyline also in The Boys, season 1. So there are a lot of parallels between these. No matter which country a lot of folks are from that have experienced these human rights atrocities, there are a ton of parallels that we only see if we open our eyes and we stare straight at them. Folks who have experienced these refugee crises and human rights abuses say that they want Americans to know what happened to Guatemalans during the armed conflict. They want people to know what happened with Sudan and in the areas that were surrounding it, what happened in Syria. They want folks to understand about how economic hardships today that were caused by these events in the past force people to flee and become refugees. It's important to know what they're fleeing from. Just like in archaeology, through understanding the past, we can understand the present too. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about how museums of a Western civilization participated in the looting and stripping of Mayan cultural sites. Stay tuned.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were wrapping up the Guatemalan Civil War and how that relates to a lot of different sci-fi, including Ruins and also Stargate SG-1. And also how a lot of these human rights abuses throughout history, no matter which continent or country they occur in, have a lot of parallels, especially when you read the individual stories that are coming from folks who experience them firsthand. They don't know each other, they've never read each other's stories, but a lot of them are strikingly similar in the techniques that folks use to commit the atrocities, to cover them up, where their funding comes from, and the things that they don't really tell you in a lot of United States school curricula. So up to this point in the story, we have met with Vladimir Rubicon, right? So Vladimir Rubicon is Cassandra's father. He's the one who called the FBI and said he wanted to go and look for her. And he is also an archaeologist, which is why his daughter decided she wanted to be one. So she spent her life, her childhood, on all of these digs, much like Daniel Jackson with his parents, and they fell in love with archaeology as children and became archaeologists themselves. So Cassandra is down there, but Vladimir's also done some work in Mesoamerica, and he can also act as their guide. So he's a resident archaeologist who also knows how to hire the local workers that they'll need help from. He can also find interpreters, workers, etc. So he is a valuable resource, even if it's somewhat suspect that the FBI would allow this man to go down there, especially in 1996 when the Guatemalan Civil War was just ending, and perhaps when this book was originally written, it hadn't ended yet, as they're generally written like the year or so beforehand and then go through the editing process and then publication. So this may have been written in 94, 95, possibly, and then edited to include more information from season 3 of the X-Files. But at any rate, they've met Vladimir. He knows about the archaeology of the area too, and he knows about the artifacts, what might be valuable, so on and so forth. They don't really need him for that just yet, but I think it'll be relevant later on when they see that interior chamber that Cassandra discovered that enveloped her in light, because he'll also be able to look at it like his daughter and go, hey, I'm not necessarily a geologist like Cassandra, but I know for a fact that the Mayans did not have access to any type of metal alloys that would have allowed for this kind of sheen or these properties. So he'll know what doesn't belong when he sees it. He also knows a bit about museums and their history in the United States and Europe and the antiquities trade. So in this time, and actually still today, there was a lot of demand for pots and jade and any type of panels with writing on them. So whether that be those stela or just those, any type of writing, anything with writing on it. If it's made of stone and it has writing on it, whether it weighs 5 pounds or a ton, people wanted those. The bigger the better, the more ornate the better, even though a lot of folks could not read them or really see what they said. That part didn't matter. They liked them as pieces of art, and just knowing it was super old made them feel that it was a lot more valuable. So in addition to all the other folks in the black market trade who were dealing in illegal antiquities and working with drug cartels and also firearms funding, gun running, you had museums across the United States and Europe who were also buying these pieces. It was kind of a don't ask, don't tell principle, where if you could get a hold of anything Mayan, you just would not ask questions about where they came from. You wanted to know that it was Mayan, and specifically, hey, it's in this general region, or etc., things that they might not be able to find out about it without context, but they're not going to ask specifically where it came from, whether it was looted or acquired legitimately. Now, I use the term legitimately loosely because US and European history, as it relates to museums in particular, are largely a history of colonization. It's colonialism at its finest, where you're going in and you're just taking these objects that belong in another country and you're putting them in a little box in your country. And people don't always want you to take those objects. Now, in ruins, we know that UC San Diego has given this group of archaeologists a sum of money to go down to the Yucatan and bring some of these things back from Quintana Roo. We also know that that Mexican state also matched that funding to help them get gear like the scuba equipment for the cenote and other equipment to examine the ruins. But it doesn't necessarily say what's going to happen with the artifacts, what's going to happen with any of the findings. Who do those belong to at that point? So it just depends on the context of history and where the funding is coming from, but it's important to recognize that museums are largely about colonization. And it's been no different in Mesoamerica. They just did a don't ask, don't tell, similar to a lot of stuff in the Mummy series. And I am talking about the Brendan Fraser one. So after they did all of this, that digging and looting of these areas devastated the information that we could get about it from archaeology for that country. Information like that in my opinion, belongs to no one or belongs to everyone. I'm not sure which way to go with that, but you get what I mean. I don't think it can belong to an individual, like when people go and get the rights to study these areas and then write it up for a journal, and then only people who pay a crazy amount of money have access to the information that came from there. That's just another form of colonization, in my opinion, because it also disproportionately impacts indigenous people. It disproportionately impacts people who don't speak the language that you are writing this in. And by that, I do mean largely English, where folks go down there and then don't get that information translated for other people in that state or in that country from where they took that information. And they also only keep it in the academic arena. As someone who has worked in academia for a while, I am very pro sharing information. I think that information should be available to everyone, especially now that we have the internet. There's no reason for it not to be. They could also just as easily make scans of some of these materials rather than taking them from where they are. I think it's more up to the individual areas and the indigenous people to decide what they want to do with that, rather than just turning everything in human history into a pitch for capitalism. Otherwise, we end up still having what we have always had, just huge areas around the globe where indigenous people have had their history ripped from the ground and sold to Western civilizations, especially the United States and Europe. The people who grew up in these areas have no way of seeing their own history because it has been sold to other continents. It disproportionately impacts people who are poor. So the entire way around, ruins shows us what the antiquities trade also shows us, that poor people, and thereby also indigenous people, because of the population demographics of that area, are disproportionately impacted by this. They keep getting screwed over. They're the ones finding these things, but they have to fork it over for $20 to $100 from all that work, only for someone else to sell it for $20,000. And then that money is used to fund the drug trade or the gun trades that are also keeping them oppressed and are often perpetuated and supported by the US government and their allies. Perhaps in the future, museums and archaeology may look more like it does in shows like Demolition Man or Altered Carbon, where they're scans and holograms largely, instead of items removed entirely out of context. And like in Demolition Man, they have kept parts of Los Angeles from way back when, largely like they were before, just by encasing sections of them in steel with glass tops on them, so you can look down into them. And they don't have any of the artifacts removed. No one is going in there and touching them. They're not exposed to modern air, so they're not degrading, but you can still see them. You can still experience them in situ wherever they derived. And for archaeologists, that may end up being more ideal because that keeps them in their context and helps us understand the different periods in their history. If we remove them, then they tell us nearly nothing. You can then just return it to the country of origin, so people at least have that back, and I think that that is an important step. It should be at least offered. But archaeologically, after these items have been looted and sold, they've had their provenance and their provenience erased, so that messes with them both archaeologically and in the art history context, in addition to whatever else may have happened with funding things on the black market in the meantime. So these artifacts do have a storied past, but it's not one we will ever know. it really only does harm. Fortunately, over the years, the practice of looting in a lot of areas in especially Guatemala, but particularly the Northern Triangle and the southern tip of Mexico, has chilled out a bit as Guatemala stabilized more than it had been during that 36-year civil war from 1960 to 1996. There have been new ways to make money that aren't necessarily associated with war and the black markets. People who are deeper in the jungle, the people who are more likely to be poor and rural and indigenous, are able to have different avenues for making money too. That doesn't necessarily mean that huecheros, any type of looters, are just hard to find now. They're still prevalent, they're still active. It's just not as bad, perhaps, as it was before. In fact, someone tried to sell National Geographic a looted item in 2014. They've probably been offered more since then, but that's just the one I know of that is documented. A lot of these looters, according to cultural anthropologists in the area, also work alongside drug traffickers to get their material north, to get them into the United States, where they know that as long as they don't tell and no one asks, they can sell these objects to U.S. museums or find someone in the U.S. who can broker them to people in Europe. In fact, most of the looted material is either in museums who are pretty unscrupulous and are doing this don't ask, don't tell type of thing, or in private collections, like those that belong to Javier Salida in the book Ruins. There are many people in Guatemala, the Northern Triangle, who are collectors of these types of antiquities. Some of them are very careful with them and they prize them as treasures, but not everyone is. Some folks have these ancient bowls in their homes that are worth a lot in their archaeological context and also worth quite a bit to collectors, but folks use them to keep their keys in them. Lastly, thanks to this antiquities trade that's illegal, it causes these gaps in provenance. Those gaps that art collectors and art historians really don't like, because that means that it's capable of being forged. You might have something that is a forgery. And in actuality, about 85% of the pots on the market today are fake. Stone carvings are a lot harder to date accurately, and it may be that more than 85% of them on the market are fake. A lot of U.S. museums today very, very likely display forgeries. The same thing for Europe. Some folks who are dating these antiquities and are experts in these antiquities say that it's a huge problem, and sometimes when they are visiting donors for museums and such, they see that their collection is 95% fraudulent. And I like that they approach that in the book too. You see Carlos Borrello and Fernando talking or thinking about how Javier Salida has a ton of fraudulent artifacts, because many of them were commissioned by Fernando himself. And although there are a lot of arguments on different sides, particularly in the archaeological communities, regarding what should go where, what should be repatriated, and how these items should be obtained to begin with, many people still disagree and say that they should be able to still pay for these illicit items if they find ones that aren't forgeries. They think that these should be repatriated even if it means buying them from the black market and fueling that illicit trade. They look at it as supply and demand, and they go, if there's no black market, then there wouldn't be any looting, but we can either buy this and put it in our museum and know that it's real and that it's there, or we can let this just disappear into whomever's hands and have it end up with a private collection, and it may disappear from the country it is from or even history altogether, depending on how well that person takes care of it. So for now, a lot of folks who used to loot are working in archaeological digs again, and they're doing so legitimately because they're able to be paid more for it than they would necessarily get for the $20 per pot that they find. And some of them work just guarding the site against looters. They know how those folks normally get in because they used to do it. And so they're able to understand how these different sites are connected to each other and how to prevent looters from coming in. Some of them even say that they feel a lot more relaxed now than they did before. They were spending a lot of their money on women and beer, which is what Fernando and Carlos Borreo do as soon as they get that money from Señor Salida, and they send Pepe off into the forest, into the jungle. They decide to go to Cancun, and it's heavily implied that they're going to spend it on women and beer. And much like the characters in the book, many people who are former looters and are back to helping guard these sites against looters or are being paid as workers for these archaeological sites say they're more relaxed because they're not working outside of the law. They are working, and the money that they do earn is earned honestly. And even the character of Fernando Victorio Aguilar does express some concern about that in general, although he largely views it as stealing as being wrong when it's from live people, but it is okay for him. It's at least not as upsetting if he is stealing from the dead, if he's stealing by looting these sites. So everyone looks at these things differently, and the world is truly in shades of gray, depending on how you look at it. But I hope that this has given you some more context for understanding ruins and seeing that it's not just this crazy story with like 7 different plot lines going on, but rather a very true-to-life depiction of what this area looked like around 1996 when it was written, and how the changes that occurred then that are fictionalized in ruins, but were actively happening at the time in real life, have resulted in these ripples that have caused the migrant crisis that we see today. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.